Okay, I think we are ready to start. Yes? I can see everybody on screen. That's great. Well, welcome. I'm Bob Putnam of Action Design, and we are delighted to be hosting this special event and to introduce two important books. One by both by our friends and colleagues of many years, Diana McLean Smith, who I think is on screen spotlighted now, and we go back a long way, like with Phil MacArthur. The three of us started Action Design, and Jeff Wetzler, who's been working with us for many of those 30 years. And so we are delighted to see so many friends on the screen with us too. I see some people I know from Australia, so we are truly global.
Wow.
I do indeed. Now, both of the books that you're going to hear about tonight grow out of the body of work that has been the foundation of Action Design for more than 3 decades. Diana's book takes it to the societal level and how we as citizens can work together to heal the divisiveness that plagues us. And by the way, today is launch day for Diana's book. So it will appear at your neighborhood bookshop, or at least on Amazon today. Jeff's book helps people discover the interpersonal practices that enable us as individuals to be the agents of mutual understanding and learning who can do that work. So together, we're covering the waterfront to make the world a better place. And we hope that what you hear tonight will both inspire and energize you to carry on that work. So welcome again. So I'm going to hand it over to my partner, Phil MacArthur, to review the agenda and get the program started.
So look, hello to everybody, and echoing what Bob said, it's wonderful to see so many folks that we've known for so many years from all over the globe. And I see that some people, Jane, I saw you holding up the book, and Jeff said he's got the book. So I don't know why you got the book before I got the book, but I'll talk to Di about that. Anyway, look, I want to give the agenda very briefly. While I'm doing that, please, if you haven't done it yet, put your name, your location, and your reason for joining in the chat. And as you're doing that, I may call on a couple of you that I've known over the years, like you, Bill Noonan, so wake up over there. So look, here's the plan for tonight. Di's going to start with an overview of her book and how she sees her work connecting to Jeff's book. She's going to have about 10 minutes to do that. And then I'm going to ask Jeff to give his overview of his book and how he sees it connecting to Di's. And then we're going to have a Q&A discussion. To get you prepared for that, we're going to put up 2 questions on the screen. What resonates for you as most important and helpful in what you're hearing from both Di and Jeff? And also, what questions and concerns do you have? And I'm going to give you about 90 seconds to think about one of those 2 questions and put that in the chat. I'll let you know when we're there. Don't worry about having to put stuff in the chat while they're talking. We would really like you to be focused on listening to them and not having a second and third webinar going in the chat, as I know we're often want to do in these sessions. And then we're going to have a back and forth. When you're putting in your question, I'll ask you to put in, is it to Di? Is it to Jeff? Is it to both of them? And then Bob and I will be curating that and posing one to Di, one to Jeff, one to Di, one to Jeff. And we'll have about, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes for that back and forth. And then we'll close the session. Jeff and Di have got questions they would like to pose to you, to take away, to think about, a call to action. There's no way that Diana would have a webinar like this and not have a call to action to this group. So we will put that out. And then we will send out a survey to you to collect your responses to both the call to action and the questions they're going to pose. And then we're going to give a round of applause to all of us for joining tonight, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. So with that, just checking here as you're putting your, Jane said, I've got the pleasure to know Diana and Jeff through the New Prophet, fans of both of them and their impressive bodies of work. Hey, Scott, nice to see you again. Jeff was the person who first introduced me and started to train me in this material. Scott's been a faculty member with our, in our work at the Action Design Institute for years. Hey to you, Vicki. Really nice to see you again. Jim Phils, are you out there?
Oh my God.
Oh boy, so wonderful to see you again, my friend. Robert Witherspoon, sir, so many years. All right, look, well, thank you. It's been great. It's great to have you all here. And this is going to be very useful, I think, for Jeff and Di to collect. We'll be saving the chat. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Diana to talk about her book.
I have to say, this is already a very moving day for me. I'm not muted, am I?
No,
Good.
you're okay.
Anyway, this was already a very moving day for me, but now I've looked around the room and seen people I haven't seen for ages: Bill Underwood, Jim Phils. I even saw David Gage's name, although he's got an empty chair. I thought when I began, I was going to acknowledge that Phil and Bob and I have been together for 45 years, Bob, not 30. I went and did the number counting. But David Gage and I go back to when I was 18 years old, so he trumps. So it's just amazing to be here today with the book coming out and being with this group. My partners, Bob and Phil, have been with me on this journey all along. And so every word on that book has been shaped by our partnership and also by the mentorship of Chris Argyris and Don Schern, who had a profound impact on us. We carried on their work and we built on it since we studied with them 35, 40 years ago. And then Jeff Wetzler, who's here tonight and will be following me with a talk, was a student of mine in a 2-year program at Monitor, where I led a program at Monitor University for 2 years. And Jeff has carried on and built on the learning he did there, both in his organizational leadership, his thought leadership, and now in his book, Ask. And so there's a continual thread through here, which goes all the way into organizations, because tonight, my dear friends and extended family, Susan Alcianbi and Kevin Ozen and their daughter, Ava, hi, Ava, are here tonight. And I'm delighted about that. Ava's going to be a force of nature. I first met Susan 10 years ago at Teach for America. She was a member of their leadership team and I was their coach. And she went on to form her own firm, Alari Network, and she's now carrying on and building on what she's learned. So many threads here tonight, and they're connecting us all in a fabric that's getting stronger and longer. And that is just so delightful to me. So let me begin where I began when I first started thinking about this book. It was back in 2020, the pandemic was still going on. Trump was still president when I started thinking about this book. And 2 trends were increasingly putting our country and our futures at risk. And I want to say a little bit about those trends and how I think about those trends and how it led me to write this book. So the first trend was polarization. As this chart shows, since 2000, political polarization in the US has increased 2-fold. And that's significantly more than any other advanced democracy. And all you have to do is open up the paper every day and you'll hear about polarization. It occurred to me, though, as I thought about this more and I did more research, that polarization was really the symptom, not the cause of what was ailing us. And so when I started to dig deeper, I began to think that there was something at play here that we needed to address, that if we didn't address, we were not going to be able to deal with any of the polarization. And it goes like this. And that is, and this is something that I think is very important and often overlooked, and that is, as a nation and as a people, we have always lived separate lives in groups divided along demographic and ideological lines. And every so often throughout our history, these groups grow increasingly insular and closed within and distant and hostile across. So that was a fundamental insight that many people have come to in terms of thinking about the distance across groups and the hostility across groups. But I began to see that this was a dynamic that was self-reinforcing, that the more insular and closed we became, the more distant and hostile we became. And the more distant and hostile we became, the more closed and insular we became. And it was starting to escalate out of control by the time I thought about writing the book. Now, the problem with this is not just it's miserable to be a part of. It's just miserable to be a part of it. But it also makes it impossible for us to address any of the challenges we need to address going forward as a country, whether it's climate change, whether it's failing educational systems, whether it's immigration, whether it's economic inequality. It's just impossible to address this as long as the groups that we live in are insular within and distant and hostile across. So that's one trend. So the second trend is a trend that amplifies the first. And since 2000, there's been a rise of 24-hour news and social media. Now, we all know that. But what we pay less attention to is that both of those are part of a larger media culture that lives by the motto, if it bleeds, it leads. So that focuses entirely on negative things, diagnosing problems, but not on saying what some solutions might be. And this media culture feeds on and fuels our behavior, yours and mine, because we're living in our own little tiny media places that make us more insular within and more distant across. So from my work over decades in systems, both large and small, families, organizations at the national level, I could see how if uninterrupted, this would render we the people essentially helpless and increasingly unable to address the threats we need to address, which would lay the ground for two things: for us getting played every day by people with economic and political power we don't have, and secondly, for the rise of authoritarianism, which we've already seen happen. So then I began to really get depressed like everybody else. And I noticed what I'm calling a media anomaly. I began to notice a few stories around the edges. They weren't everywhere, but a story here, a story there. And these stories were different from the media culture. They were starting to focus on what regular individuals, regular people were doing to solve problems in their communities, to heal divides, to make bridges. And I thought, well, that's anomalous. It's not many people. It's just a few people. And even in the book, I say tens of thousands because I was stunned it was tens of thousands. Ends up it's hundreds of thousands of people across the country are beginning to address the space between us, the insular closed space within and the distant space across. And they're starting to break out, helping people break out of the insular closed spaces within and build bridges across. So then I began to say, okay, so I got to figure this out. I got to see how big this is. And so if you go back to thinking about the two trends, one trend is to say space between us, how we're getting more insular within, more distant across. And the other trend is the media culture getting more and more negative and hysterical and polarized and polarizing, okay? So those are the two trends. Well, I found on the space between us, a number of people, and I can't go in. How much time do I have, Phil?
You got about 3 minutes.
Okay. So I discovered, and it's in the book. So if you buy the book, you'll get a great in-depth description of this. But there's an organization called Braver Angels. It's one example. It's huge. It's nationwide. And they structure constructive debates. They bring people together, reds and blues, and they structure conversations between them so that they can start to learn about the different perspectives. There's an organization called Not in Our Town in 1999, and they built since then, 1999 in Billings, Montana. A Native American home was sprayed with graffiti, a SWAT sticker, and the local painters union came and painted it over. And then an African American church was terrorized by skinheads, and white neighbors started to go to the church and accompany their neighbors to church. And then young child menorah was hit in a window. A brick went through a window. And the newspaper published paper menorahs, and everybody in the town put menorahs in the windows. And a woman by the name of Patrice O'Neill decided to do a film of how the town responded. And she wanted to show it to the people that she knew in California to see what they thought of Billings. People in California said, I don't want to talk about Billings. I want to talk about my town. And all of a sudden, Not in Our Town now has thousands of offices all around the country. And their basic idea is to build communities of belonging, which do not allow for hate to take root. Then there was in Maine, the Maine People's Alliance, which fought back against a right-wing governor and got Black Mainers and white Mainers for the first time to come together. In Congress, there was a fellow by the name of Derek Kilmer, a congressman, who created a committee that was able to pass 200 recommendations for how to improve how Congress works by forming a bipartisan committee where Republicans and Democrats sat next to each other and talked to each other. In Pittsburgh, after the terrorist attack, communities that had been segregated for hundreds of years came together to fight back against hate. The list just goes on and on. I was absolutely stunned at the number of things going on, and you never hear about it. Okay.
One more minute, Di.
Okay. So, and then there are a bunch of people fighting the media culture, including solutions journalism, which is the most important, but there are a bunch of them. So here's what I took from moral lessons for you and I. One, join the movement. There are a gazillion organizations out there that are doing God's work, and you can all join them. The second is we've got to stop building cases with people on the other side of a divide, and we have to start building relationships with them. And the argument for that is in the book. We need to focus on hopes and interests, not worries and positions. The Maine's People Alliance took off because people cared deeply about healthcare, and they came together around that. The third is to explore ways to find or create common ground. The people in Pittsburgh wanted to be safe, and they were willing to work across divides in order to create that safety. The fourth is to invent ways to build on that common ground by creating structures that allow us to come together and remake the space between us. That's where we always start. We try to create the structures before we've built the relationships and before we've understood people's hopes and interests and before we've created common ground. And that's why those structures never work. We need to do the pre-work. So that's it.
That's it.
That's it. Oh, Jeff. So the conversations that you have, that you need to have, I think Jeff is uniquely positioned to facilitate. So I give it to you, Jeff.
Well, I will say, having read every word of your book, that's not it. There's a lot more to it. And I hope we get to talk more about it, because there's just, I think, very pragmatic and, and tangible strategies that flesh out all of the different things that you just said. And it's just an incredible book. But I'll say a little bit about the book that I have been writing as well, which will launch next month. And I want to say, first of all, this is also an emotional moment for me. This is a full circle moment. The action design and the action design community in many ways raised me, both professionally and also in very personal ways. And I dedicate the book to my mentors, multiple of whom are literally here right now today. And so my hope in writing the book is really to pay forward so much of what I learned from Bob and Phil and Diana and Iris and many other people on this call. And so it's special, and it's just very moving to be together in this community. The main premise of the book is that at both the individual level and at the organizational level, too much stuff that is really important for us to know is stuck in other people's left-hand columns. And I'll use that jargon because I know so many people here know action science, but said differently, we are each surrounded by people in our lives, whether our coworkers or our clients or our investors or even our friends and family, who have ideas, thoughts, feelings, perspectives, feedback that if we would find out, we would make better decisions together. We would innovate better together. We would save time. We would be closer. But so often we don't find that out. And one of the ways that I learned that is by reading so many 2-column cases. And I saw so much good stuff in people's left-hand columns that the other person never actually found out because it stayed unspoken. But this also exists at the organizational level as well. Organizations are filled with people who have ideas and perspectives and observations And it is just such a well-documented phenomenon that far too often that collective intelligence of the organization is suppressed or stays dormant. There all kinds of really interesting research I came across in the book. And even at the personal level, I found this one study that they surveyed over 4,000 Americans, and somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on the demographics, literally withheld information about their own health from their own doctor. The very person who actually could help them heal, get better, maybe save their life. And they weren't saying things because they didn't want to waste the doctor's time and they didn't want to be judged by the doctor. So if we are literally withholding things from our own doctor who could help us, imagine the kinds of things that people are withholding about the flaw in someone's strategic plan or the new idea that they have, etc. So I got very interested in this question of what is it that people withhold. And the whole first section of the book is called The Unspoken. And it really deals with the question of what are the top things that the people around us are most likely withholding, or I should say are too often withholding and not telling us. Things like the challenges and struggles they're facing, things like their feedback for us and their observations about how we come across or impact them, even things like their biggest and most crazy ideas that they might think are just too wacky to share, but might be the actual game changer ideas. And so the first chapter of the book really deals with what are these things? But then the question that I was really obsessed with is, well, why? Why are people withholding? And so that's what the second chapter of the book talks about. And it talks about it in general in terms of barriers like people's fear of the impact of saying what they might have to say, or also just being tired or not be able to find the right words. But it also talks about how this is really exacerbated when there are power dynamics at play. And when there are conversations across lines of difference as well. And so we get into all of that. And, it's backed up by fascinating research. I found this research by someone named Nick Epley, who talks about the desire that people have to overcome this, to actually find out what other people think, feel, and know, but how the most common strategies just don't work. Strategies that we are often told, like, try to read their body language, then you'll know what they're really thinking. It doesn't work. Try to put yourself in their shoes. It just doesn't work. There is literally only one strategy that he found that actually reliably works to find out what someone else is really thinking, feeling, and knowing. And that strategy is to ask them. But asking them is something that that we're often not taught how to do well. It's something that action design obviously thinks a lot about and helps people to do well, but far too often we don't really know how to ask. And so that's the core of the book, which is how do we actually learn from other people? And so in the book, I introduce an approach that's called the ask approach, and we can just put the visual up really quickly on it, and I'll just quickly walk you through it. It's 5 core practices that, when put together and implemented, give us the very best chance we have of learning what are the most important things that other people think, feel, and know. And so the first practice of the ask approach is choosing curiosity. Approaching curiosity not as a trait that some people have and other people don't, or a state of mind that we're in, but really a deliberate choice that we make, a decision that's always available to us, and a decision that when we do it has the possibility of really connecting us to other people. And when we choose curiosity, we're putting in the very front of our minds this question of what can I learn from the other person? And in the book, I talk a lot about how tools like the ladder of inference can help us inject question marks into our otherwise certain stories about ourselves and the world and other people. But I also take on some other curiosity killers, things like emotional triggering and how we can use our emotions as cues to get curious, but also killers like stress and speed and how that can actually diminish our curiosity, what we can do about that, and also cultural pressures for certainty along the lines of what Diana has talked about. So all of that is choosing curiosity. But one of the things that I discovered the hard way in my own leadership is that even if I'm really curious to learn from someone else, if they don't feel safe telling me their truth, especially if it's a hard truth, it doesn't matter how curious I am. And so this next step is called Make It Safe. It also builds on a lot of the research by Amy Edmondson on psychological safety at the organizational level, but it asks, what does it look like to make it safe at the individual level? And I talk about what are the ways we can create connection and the kinds of trust and connection that makes it safer and easier for people to share truth. How do we open up ourselves, not just about our true agenda for asking the questions, but also our own thoughts and points of view that may feel vulnerable to share? And how do we radiate resilience so that other people can know that we're not going to crumble when they actually tell us their truth. Or if we do have an emotional reaction, that we're not going to hold them responsible for our own reactions. So those are some of the strategies that I get into around Make It Safe. Then at the heart of the book is posing quality questions. And we all know that good communicators ask more questions. We all have a few common go-tos. But what most people don't know is that there's a science to this. We might even call it action science, because action design and others have truly delved into this. And in the book, I distinguish between crummy questions versus quality questions. And I define quality questions very simply as questions that help us learn something important from the other person. And we get into a taxonomy of different kinds of quality questions that not only help us hear the headline of what people have to say, but also, to Diana's point, dig deeper. Where does it come from? What's your life experience? What are some stories, not just data points, but what is your lived experience that helps you get to that? And questions that invite their reactions to what we own, to what we ourselves think and our own points of view, and questions that elicit their best ideas and so on. And so this chapter is really the full taxonomy of different kinds of questions, almost the way that a surgeon would think about, I would use this tool if I want to learn this, if I want to do this. And we could say, here's a question I could use if I want to learn this type of insight from someone. And then, of course, once we pose the question, it really comes down to how well we listen. And we all know things like active listening and deep listening. And we know it's important to be a good listener. But it turns out that even when we think we're listening, there's so much information we're missing. And for the book, I interviewed professional listeners. So I interviewed people like award-winning journalists. I remember talking to one journalist named Jenny Anderson, who said to me that whenever she can, she will audio record her interviews, and she'll go back and listen to them 2, 3, 4, 5 times over and over again. And each time she listens to them, she hears a new insight that she hadn't heard the first time before.
2 more minutes, Jeff.
Great. And I thought to myself, if a journalist who's a professional listener is missing things the first time, the second time, the third time, how much are we missing as well? And so this chapter really draws on listening strategies. It pulls from David Cantor and his theories of affect, meaning, and power to say, how can we listen for the content of what people are saying and the emotion and the actions that they're taking? And how can we make sure that we're also listening for what's not being said as well? So that's listening to learn. And then the last piece is, I think, my favorite of all of the strategies, which is reflecting and reconnecting, because this is how we actually make meaning of what we actually hear from someone. And the first, I talk about a method called sift and turn. Sifting is first just saying, of everything that I heard, what's most important? And often borrowing help from our friends and colleagues and thought partners to help us make sure that we're sifting in ways that don't just confirm our own biases, but then reflecting in ways that help us to say, what can I take from this that would affect my thinking about what's going on here, my story, the next steps that I should take, and also some of my deeper held assumptions, and trying to make reflection a structured and practical set of things that we can all do, but to not do by ourselves, but to ultimately reconnect with the other person and to go back and say, here's how I made meaning of what I learned from you. And thank you. And what did I get right? And what would you modify? What would you hope I would take away differently? And doing that in ways that enable the other person to know that we actually really value what we heard from them, but also that they can help us continue that learning and keep the door open for the future. So those are the 5 practices of the Ask approach. That's the core of the book. And then the final section of the book just talks about, how do we make this a superpower? How can we make this a superpower individually in terms of getting really good at this at an individual level? How can we help our teams and organizations build this into the DNA of every practice, from hiring to decision-making, to incentives, to leadership, to rewards, to culture, et cetera? Then how can we actually get the next generation good at this? How do we actually keep the curiosity alive in young people and continue to develop curious question askers? And then finally, the book closes in a way that I think comes full circle to meet Diana's book, which is to say, what would it mean if we approached somebody who seemed like the other with a mindset of, they have something to teach me, there's something I can learn from them, and tried to apply the Ask approach in ways that could start to reach across the kinds of divides that Diana described in our society.
Great. Yeah, look, thank you both. And, I think what we're hearing that is exciting is a real deepening of the different kinds of intelligences that we're all familiar with, from emotional intelligence to relationship intelligence to conversational intelligence to collective intelligence, but now also talking about what does that mean for citizenship intelligence? And I think it's very exciting to see how Diana and Jeff are pulling these ideas together, very thoroughly researched, wonderful stories. I mean, Jeff has written a book that I could not write because he's been a leader in an organization trying to establish this learning culture. And I think it's exciting to read the kinds of stories that he is developing, as well as Di's book. So look, what I'd like you to do is take a minute and a half as you've listened. What's resonated for you in what you've heard? What questions or concerns do you have that you'd like Jeff and Di to respond to? So I'll give you about 90 seconds. And if you would, type your question, your comment into the chat. And please, if you want it directed to Di, put to Di. If it's to Jeff, please put it to Jeff. And then we will start our back and forth, our Q&A period. All right, I'm hoping you've had the opportunity to put in one question, one comment, and I'm going to start us off. Di, one question. What hope do you have for your book?
Did you listen to Bill Noonan?
Why wouldn't I start with Bill?
Right.
Go ahead.
No, my biggest hope, the reason I wrote the book is that I think too many of us are hoping for a leader to come to our salvation, and I don't think they're coming. I think it's up to us. I think we've actually inadvertently, not by design, not by consciously, created an ungovernable landscape, and it's selecting out the best leaders. So I think we're at a point now where our best hope is us. And the reason why I'm hopeful about that is I really do believe it's how we have designed the structure between us. Again, not necessarily consciously, there are a lot of forces that have driven that. But because that's the problem, it's within our control to fix it. In fact, it's only within our control to fix it. And I think we're so exhausted and despairing about polarization and what we see around us that we have lost sight of the power that we have. So my hope is that this book will both inspire and empower people to take back their power, not get played, and to start to do the necessary work of rebuilding our country.
Jeff, any comment that you'd like to make?
I just say amen.
So
Good
let
comment.
me offer a question for Jeff then, yeah? And this is from Robert Witherspoon, an old friend of ours who's been to many of our institutes. Yes, indeed.
Hello,
And
Robert.
yes, and Robert writes, I'm excited by the ask approach, and I'm curious, what happened to advocacy, as in combining inquiry and advocacy? How do you think about that, Jeff?
I appreciate the question. And I think one of the risks of writing a book that focuses on the inquiry side of advocacy and inquiry is that it could send the message, only inquire, only ask. And I think we know, from this community that only asking can be problematic in all kinds of ways, just the same way that only advocating can be problematic. And yet I decided to focus on that part of advocacy and inquiry for two reasons. One is because it's one that I personally feel just very passionate about and personally drawn to. And two is because in my time doing this work with people, I just saw how underrepresented inquiry was, and how many case discussions had no questions, or no genuine questions in them at all, and the power that came out just of getting curious and asking a question. So I wanted to really shine a spotlight on that. But I've tried, and if you read the book, you can decide if I've done justice to this or not. I've tried in a number of places to say it's not just about asking questions. So, for example, in the step about make it safe, and a really important part of making it safe is saying where we're coming from. What is our agenda for asking the question? What is our own perspective? And in fact, in many of the questions and post quality questions starts with, here's my view, and what do you think? And how does that land with you? And what are your reactions? And what might I be missing? And so I've tried to bring in the importance of both advocacy and inquiry throughout it, even while the book is lifting up one piece of that, which I think is a particularly missing piece.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
Can I say one thing on I think
Please.
you're defining what it means to ask a question. It's
Mm.
not any old question. And, you're not bifurcating advocacy and inquiry. You're saying good inquiry encompasses saying where you're coming from, why you're asking the question. I think that's a really important perspective.
And not hiding your agenda.
Not hiding your agenda,
Right.
but you're focusing on the quality of inquiry.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Di, question from Megumi. She said, Di, I'm interested to hear what you saw as the source of becoming insular within and distant across. My guess is fear and trauma, but would love to hear what you found.
This is where I always get into trouble because it can sound a little too theoretical, but let me give it a try. I think there are 5 forces that are driving us closer within and distant across. One is history. We grew up in a country which right from the start ranked and sorted people into groups. That's part of our heritage. It's part of our DNA. It's how we've been socialized. Which brings me to the second, which is that throughout the time we've evolved in our country, we've built a culture and passed down a culture from one person to another. I just started reading a book that Jeff turned me on to, Waking Up White. And if you haven't read it, you got to get it, because I'll tell you, the first chapter is just stunning for the osmosis through which we absorb beliefs that groups are better or lesser than one another. Okay, that we have to win, we can't lose. This is what we're fighting against with Jeff's book, with our work. We might differ with each other, but we don't differ on how we disagree. We're intent on getting our view across and winning our argument, whether we do it through questions or advocating. So you have cultural and historical forces at play, and then you also have implicit biases, and those implicit biases are implicit. We're not even aware of them. And so one of the most fascinating things is that our explicit biases have gone down like 97%, but our implicit biases around race have only gone down, I think, about 30%, which means a lot of people are walking around thinking they're no longer biased, but the people who are the brunt of it, they see you're biased, okay? So, implicit bias is tough. And then another force is that we all have emotional defenses that protect us, our status, our identity, our esteem. It makes us very, very, very difficult for us to understand our part in a problem. So all of these forces, and I'm forgetting what the 5th one is, but if I were younger, I'd remember it. But I'm not, so I won't. But those forces drive all of us to get closer within and further across and not to be able to see it.
It was psychological defenses,
That was the fourth that I said.
cognitive biases and shortcuts. Then you haven't talked about that.
No, implicit biases and cognitive biases really fall in the same bucket. I'm just blanking. It doesn't matter. I mean, it really is in the book. If I had it in front of me,
It is. I'm looking at the table right here, folks. So it's in the book.
Oh, you're looking at the table of the five forces?
Yeah.
And so what does they say?
We all share a
History,
history in which
culture.
groups were sorted and ranked. You talked
Yep.
about that.
Yep.
And we all inherited from this history a set of cultural beliefs.
Yep.
Beliefs think of groups as more or less, better than, win, lose.
Right.
But history and culture together produce segmented hierarchical institutions.
That's the one I missed.
Oh,
And
you
that's
missed.
where it all happens.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. You missed the most important thing. Based on that history and culture, we've created not just a slavery, which is one institution that was a product of it. Every institution we have is based on a hierarchy through which we absorb through osmosis these beliefs and this history, and we're completely oblivious to it. And then you have the implicit biases and you have the emotional defenses.
Well done.
This is why you should never say the number of things you're going to say at the beginning, because that way you may not
I
get through
know,
all of
but you and I both know Mark Fuller, so we know that's not going to work.
it.
Okay, shall I offer
Yeah,
Jeff a
go ahead.
question? All right, good. And this is one from yet another of our friends and colleagues, Gwen Krause. Hi, Gwen. Haven't seen you in a while now. Hope all is well. And Gwen says for Jeff, I like the step, make it safe. Any advice about how to do that? And I know your chapter is full of advice, Jeff, but what would you say in response to Gwen here and now?
I'll say a couple things. One is that even just being intentional about the time and place and space of the interaction can make a big difference. For the book, part of what I did was I interviewed some iconic CEOs, people who ran organizations like Kraft or Medtronic, and asked them, how do you make it safe for people in your organizations as CEOs to tell you the truth? And one of the things that they both went to was the physical location and the time and space. So they, Bill George of Medtronic said, if I want to really make it safe for someone, I will never bring them into my office and have them sit across the big CEO desk from me, because I know that's too intimidating. We're going to go sit on a couch together. We're going to go take a walk. And Irene Rosenfeld would say, I will go sit in the cafeteria and I will go out to the ride-alongs with salespeople. So I'm on their turf. And so even just the time, place, space, and what works for the other person, not what works for us. And I've experienced this in my own personal life as well with my teenage daughter. When she comes home from school and I want to know what's going on in her life, and I ask her, how was your day? What happened? What did you learn? I get absolutely nothing. But if I go onto her turf, which means I stay up till 11 or 11:30 at night, when she's done with her homework and she's done talking with her friends and wants me to hang out in her room, all of a sudden everything comes out. And so if I want to learn, I've got to go to her and to her place and so I would say that's one of the things that that I found really interesting that I learned as part of doing the book about making it safe.
Great, thank you.
All right, I've got one from our old buddy Jim Phils. And I think it's a question that has been on many of our minds over the years that we've been doing this for decades. Jim said, everything here resonates. And yet the concern I have, if this wisdom is so recognizable, so compelling, so powerful in terms of building better relationships, teams, organizations, and societies, why has it been so difficult to instantiate in settings, systems where there have been deliberate, thoughtful, prolonged, and significant investments in building the capacity for this kind of learning, these values and skills? Parentheses, and many of you know of the examples to which I am alluding. I think that could be to both of you.
I'm happy to jump in.
Go ahead. I'll follow you.
Okay. I've had many despairing moments about the difficulty of transformational change in institutions because of the five forces I just mentioned. I mean, you add all those up and it makes change very difficult. And I was in very much despair at one point and talking to Bob on a walk in the woods. And he said, ah, well, you know what? What's the quote? The poet?
Oh, the Ginsburg quote?
Yeah, yeah. So, and Bob goes, well,
Okay.
here's the thing, Diana.
Yeah,
And
the
he
quote
quotes Allen
is,
Ginsberg.
yeah, forgive the language, it's Allen Ginsberg. The world is a mountain of shit. I must move it by handfuls.
And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, and what that inspired in me was starting to think about a stage theory of change. Because if you go for the whole enchilada right from the beginning, I think a lot of people get very nervous because they can't imagine what it will require of them in terms of their time, energy, money, everything in order to make it work. So you have to have some kind of stage theory of change that allows people to think about how they can incrementally move in a different direction. And I don't think many change agents do that. I don't think many leaders do that. I think they superimpose what they believe the change ought to be. It ought to happen quickly, and you ought to do it now. One of the things that's always surprised me is when people talk about resistance to change. I have encountered resistance to change. I don't want to make it sound like I haven't. But when I'm at my most effective, it's because what I'm doing meets needs that they have. And the reality is people have multiple needs and they're in conflict with one another. And so your job, if you're somebody who's trying to affect change in an organization, is to help people to work through their internal conflict so they can begin to move towards something that is in their best interest. And it's very, very difficult because of all the forces I said, but it is not impossible. And I do think we're in the middle of a evolutionary change going across the globe, where people are starting to see the need to cooperate more, not compete less, but cooperate more. And I think that is going to have a huge effect if we can keep the planet alive until we get there. Jeff, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to come into it from a slightly different angle, which is I think that both what you and I are talking about is countercultural.
Yes.
And so, but both countercultural at a societal level and at most organizational levels.
Yeah.
And so we are swimming upstream, and even organizations that have invested heavily in this, and Jim, I think I probably know some of what you're referring to, and probably others I don't know totally what you're, all the examples that you're referring to. But even in those cases, the dosage of capability building and the modes of capability building that we often do, I think pale in comparison to the training and socialization that are going against the grain of what we're trying to teach as well. And so I think it calls us to think even more creatively about how do we support this learning? How do we support the reinforcement of this learning? How do we think about unlearning in new and different kinds of ways? How do we not just think about training or skill building, but also real-time support as well? And I'm motivated to think a lot about the range of different levers that we can use to kind of work against the grain on this.
I think that's a really important point.
Bob, you got another one?
I do. And let's see, let me ask this. This is from Susan Asayanbi. It's to Jeff. Can you share how you see the connection between asking and vulnerability?
Yeah. And Susan, you have obviously taught me lots on this question. We've had amazing conversations on this question. I think it's I think the connection to vulnerability and asking happens in both directions. So when we're asking a question of someone else, we could be asking them something that makes them feel vulnerable. And simultaneously, the act of asking itself can be a vulnerable act because we may be exposing something we don't know, and we're putting ourselves out there. There is interesting research that talks about how people overestimate the degree to which other people will feel put off by what could be seen as a sensitive question, and the degree to which actually they would welcome the chance to be asked this question. Obviously, there's limits to that as well. So I think that in some ways we have some biases around overprotection of other people and ourselves as it relates to vulnerability. But the vulnerability piece on the part of the other person being asked is really a lot about what I think made me feel the need to elevate, make it safe to one of these core practices. Because if we are asking someone else to be vulnerable, often we've got to be vulnerable ourselves. And that takes trust and that takes courage. And also, if we're asking a question, particularly a question that is that could lead someone else to reveal some feedback that could be really hard for us to hear, that alone can make us vulnerable. And that's a piece that I actually haven't dealt as much with in the book, and I would like to deal more with. But I do think that there's a real element of courage involved on both directions in the asking process.
Thank you.
Donna, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was right on target. Grasshopper, you've
Yeah.
taken double from my hand.
Now, Phil, online consultation. We're near the point that the Q&A is going to be done.
Yeah.
Do you have a sort of Di's turn if we got time for one more? Do you have one? Or I do have one for Diana that I noticed. Yeah, shall I go with that? Or do you have one?
Yeah, go with that.
Okay, this is from our old friend Bill Underwood.
Hey, Bill.
Oh, and now that I'm in it, I apologize. It's actually
For Jeff.
something of Jeff. But
Okay.
what did
So you can pick a different one. Or we
here's
can
what I
both do
got.
it. Yeah.
Diana, what differences jumped out at you when moving into the public civic space from
Yeah.
the business organizations you have worked with?
What differences?
Yeah, what differences jumped out at you is the question. And there's an assumption that there were a lot of differences, so I'd be curious. Were there?
If you look at the level of particulars, there obviously are big differences because there are a lot of dynamics in an organization that have to do with people's anxieties around performance and competition across, actually, the thing that struck me the most is how similar they are. And the biggest takeaway is that there's a tendency in organizations that is very deadly and not uncommon, where the more competition and conflict that occurs laterally in an organization across the functions, the more hierarchical an organization tends to become, because they need to dampen down the conflict in order to perform. And so the distance between the person at the top and the bottom becomes greater, and the distance between groups becomes greater, okay? And so the more competition and conflict laterally, the more control you get vertically. And the more control you get vertically, the more competition you get laterally, because you've got to compete in order to get the resources that are in the hands of a small number of people at the top. And what worried me the most about our nation is that's what we're seeing now, is that the calls for a strong man is because we are incapable of resolving our own conflicts laterally. And so that's, to me, the similarity is what's most profound. The way you go about addressing it is obviously going to be very different. And I think it's through building a movement, a citizen movement, that is locally rooted and nationally connected and goes from the bottom up, not from the top down, which is different from an organization.
All right. I think we're getting to our close. And I just want to say that from my own perspective, listening to this, this conversation, I think, has touched for me on a couple of themes. One goes back a couple of decades to a great book that was written by Bergen Smith called The Paradoxes of Group Life. And one of the paradoxes they talk about is the paradox of trust and risk. You can't take risks if you don't have trust, but in order to have trust, you take risks. To have risk, you have to have trust, and it's a loop. And also this issue that Jeff is touching on in his book of, and some of you have asked questions about trust, vulnerability, safety. Jeff, you were talking about the connection between psychological safety, which we've had a lot of writing on, and Amy has done a lot of work on, but there's also psychological resilience. And what is the relationship between psychological safety and psychological resilience? And how do we create organizations where there's both psychological safety and psychological resilience? And how do those work together? And I think that, looking at those dilemmas, those interactions, critical at the organizational level, but also, with what Di is talking about, how do you create the structures where you can bring people together at the political level, at the social level, at the community level, and take those risks, build that trust, be resilient and safe all at the same time. And it's a wonderful challenge. So look, with that said, thank you for being here with us tonight. And I want to let you both pose whatever questions you would like people to take away from this, and your call to action.
Go ahead, Diana.
No, you go first.
Okay. Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Bob and Phil for hosting this. This means a lot. It's a big deal. And for everyone who came. And I feel a lot of supportive energy in the chat as well, whether your comment got elevated or not. And so it just means a lot. And I think the question that I'm encouraging everyone to center in their mind is, what can I learn from this person? What can I learn from the person in front of me? Especially if it seems like someone I can't learn from, or someone who's particularly different, really to center that question. So I think I'll leave you with that, but would also say, if you have any thoughts, ideas about this work, this book, I would love to be in touch with you as well, and would really welcome your ideas and support and pushes and help. And we'll send out some links as well to people too. Thank you.
So I also want to thank Phil and Bob and everyone who came tonight. It is so gratifying to see so much interest in this work. And then I want to second what Jeff said. I think that is a wonderful way to put it. I think it's so important for us to be thinking about, what can we learn from this other person? And in all the work all the research that I did, the one thing that allowed people to build bridges is when they said, I'm going to stop trying to make a case, and instead I'm going to start trying to build a relationship. And while I was doing this reading, I set out to forge relationships with people with a different political ideology than I have. And I intentionally set out to do that. And it's been an amazing journey. And what I've discovered has been that we have very many of the same underlying values, concerns, and hopes, even if we have different points of view. And so I think that the call of action is get to know people in groups different from your own. Make a point of reaching out to them, and then see what you can learn from them, not what they have to learn from you. I think that's so important. And I would echo Jeff's, if there are things that you want to follow up on, please do reach out to us.
Okay, great. So as we're concluding here, as Jeff mentioned, we'll be sending something out that has some links that may be of interest to you. And along with that will be a short survey so we can learn from you.
And we'll be saving the chat to read everything.
We will indeed.
Excellent. That's great.
And Phil?
Yeah, thanks so much, folks. Wonderful to see you all, and let's find ways to stay in touch. Be well. Thank you.
Take care.
You all.
Bye, everyone.